I'm Monifa, your host for this exciting journey through the economic landscape of Oakland County. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into the numbers and trends that are shaping the future of this vibrant community. Now, who better to tell us about Oakland County than Dave Coulter, the county executive himself. Hi, Dave.
Well, hi, Monifa, and thanks. And hello, everyone. I'm Oakland County Executive Dave Coulter, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the University of Michigan economist, Gabe Ehrlich, about the economic outlook for Oakland County. Their insights and predictions are so helpful as we plan for everything from our annual budgets to the bond rating presentations that we make to the rating agencies. I think we're going to hear some really good news from Gabe, including continued low unemployment and wage gains for people working in lower paid jobs. But we also are still recovering from the pandemic that brought such hardship during the last 3 years. That's why it's so important that we're investing so heavily in workforce programs like Oakland 80, which is providing easier access to higher education and training for our residents, and Oakland Thrive, which is helping our small businesses succeed. You're going to hear more about these programs that are helping fuel Oakland County's economic recovery at the event. So thanks for your interest in our annual Economic Outlook forecast.
Thanks for that introduction, Dave. It's great to be here with all of you today. All right, everyone, now it's time to hear from the man with all the data, the economic guru himself, Dr. Gabriel Ehrlich. Get ready to have your minds blown with his insights on Oakland County's economy. Dr. Ehrlich, take it away.
Well, thanks, Monifa. My name is Gabe Ehrlich, and I'm the director of the Research Seminar in Quantitative Economics at the University of Michigan. We're the economic forecasting group at the university, and we've been here since 1952. We've been in a partnership with Oakland County for over 30 years, and we're very excited to be with you here today to share our economic outlook for Oakland County through 2025. One of the topics that we really like to dive in on when we're producing this economic outlook is to ask, how is prosperity shared across Oakland County? Because it's well known that Oakland County is more prosperous than Michigan overall. It's a very affluent county on average. But one of the questions that we had when we started digging into the numbers is, how broadly is that prosperity shared across groups and across areas in the county? We first started diving into this topic a few years ago. It got a very warm reception from our partners at the county, but unfortunately we couldn't dive into this topic last year because the pandemic disrupted the data collection that the Census Bureau used for us to produce the numbers that I'm going to show you. And so that's why you'll see on some of my graphs that I don't have any data for 2020. But I do now have data from the American Community Survey run by the Census Bureau for 2021. So that will be the most recent data that I'm going to show you, and that's what I'll focus on today. And what I'm going to show you in the first graph is a measure that we call average adjusted household income. So we take the data on household incomes and we adjust it for a few different factors: local cost of living, household size, and inflation, so that we can express all household incomes within Oakland County and in a 3-person equivalent household income scale in 2021 inflation-adjusted dollars. So the Census Bureau divides Oakland County into 8 regions called public use microdata areas, or PUMAs. And I'm showing you average adjusted household incomes for each of those 8 areas alongside the average for the state of Michigan. And the first thing you can see is that most areas in Oakland County have higher adjusted household incomes than the state of Michigan. In 2021, the average adjusted household income was about $141,000 in Oakland County versus about $104,000 in the state of Michigan. So, as I already said, and as you probably knew already, Oakland County is more prosperous overall than the state of Michigan. But hopefully what you can see in this chart is that prosperity is not distributed evenly throughout the county geographically. And so if you look at the area containing Birmingham and Bloomfield, you can see it's just, at the top of the chart in terms of household incomes. It really stands out from the other areas in Oakland County. Whereas at the bottom of the chart, there's actually only one of the 8 regions in Oakland County that trails the statewide average in terms of household incomes. And that's the area that includes Pontiac and Waterford Township. And that area actually has an average adjusted household income that's less than half the adjusted household income in the area that includes Birmingham and Bloomfield Hills. So, although Oakland County is doing great overall in terms of prosperity, and by and large that prosperity is pretty well spread across the county geographically, there are areas of the county that are still lagging behind. We also studied the distribution of prosperity across racial and ethnic groups within Oakland County. And the table I'm showing you has data for 2021, both for groups within Oakland County, and then we also show the state of Michigan overall just as a comparison. I don't think it will come as a shock that there are economic disparities across racial and ethnic groups in Oakland County. That's a statewide and a nationwide pattern. But we do think it's useful to try to put some numbers around those disparities. As people think about opportunity within Oakland County, we want it to be concrete about those distributions. So what we do is we classify households into what lower income, medium income, or middle income, and upper income households based on that adjusted household income concept. And then we classify the shares of population that live in those different households. And what you can see is, by and large, across groups, demographic groups, about 50%, give or take, of the population is in what we classify as the middle income group. But if you look at the county's Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black population, about 30% or a little bit higher of those populations live in what we classify as lower income households, whereas less than 20% of those populations live in what we classify as higher income households. And those proportions are reversed for Oakland County's non-Hispanic white and non-Hispanic Asian populations. So, it does go to show that despite the average overall prosperity in Oakland County being quite high, there remain disparities across groups within Oakland County. And then we've also split the data by renters and homeowners in Oakland County. And you can see that the disparities are even larger there. Homeowners, by and large, are much more affluent than renters. And one thing to say about the homeowners is that the average incomes in that group are held down by people who are retired and therefore have a low income, but many of those people own their homes free and clear, so they also don't have a mortgage payment. The last thing we like to do to try to gauge how prosperity is distributed across Oakland County, and also to look at the county's economic fundamentals, is to compare Oakland County to a group of its peer counties, which we define as other counties that are suburbs of large central cities that have about the same number of people as Oakland County. And so this ends up being a comparison group of some of the most prosperous areas in America. And I think it's really important to emphasize that. Some of the most affluent local economies in the nation are included in Oakland's peer group. And we compare these counties on a set of 5 socioeconomic indicators that we draw also from the American Community Survey. And what we do is we rank each county on each of those 5 measures, and they are shown on the graphic. And then we sum up those rankings to create an overall ranking. And this year, Oakland County came in 10th. So Oakland County actually ranks within the top 10 in 3 of the metrics that we track: having a low child poverty rate, having a high share of the population in professional occupations, and having a high median income. It also ranked 11th in a measure of educational attainment that we follow. So overall, we were really pleased to see that Oakland County continues to perform strongly on these metrics. We have been tracking these metrics for many years. I'm not sure how far back they go. We always think that this is a rigorous way to assess how Oakland County is doing, not just in creating economic prosperity, but also in producing a high quality of life for its residents. And we were encouraged that Oakland continues to rank in the top 10 on these measures. So one of the challenges that we always face when we're forecasting Oakland County's economy is that the official government data at the county level actually lags well behind the data we get for the national economy or even the state economy. But nonetheless, I wanted to show you where Oakland County's economy is in the latest data that we do have. And so I'm going to show you 2 measures of Oakland County's economy. The first one I've got here is resident employment. So this is employment among Oakland County residents, whether they work inside Oakland County or if they commute somewhere else for their job. And then I'm showing it alongside that same measure of employment for the state of Michigan. In most of our forecasting, we actually focus not on resident employment, but on what we call payroll employment, which is the number of jobs located within the county, regardless of where the people who work at those jobs live. But this data that I'm showing you here on resident employment is available on a much more timely basis than the payroll data that I'm going to show you, the payroll employment data. And I have to be honest that Oakland County's economy has been a little bit of a mix over the last year by this resident employment measure. And it's a little bit of a puzzle to us. Oakland County was recovering very nicely in terms of resident employment from the pandemic. But what you can see is that over the last 6 months or so of 2022, that recovery started to stall out. And we see a pretty similar pattern actually in the state of Michigan overall. It has been a little bit of a puzzle to us why we're seeing that weakness in the data. County level data can be noisy. This could reflect factors such as different commuting patterns, potentially relocations during the pandemic. So all sorts of different things could go into this. But it's something that is a little bit perplexing, and it's something we're keeping our eye on because ideally we would like to see this measure of resident employment climb back to where it was before the pandemic and then keep going beyond that. And we haven't been seeing that progress in the most recent data. The stall that we saw in terms of Oakland County's resident employment count is even more confusing in some sense when you look at Oakland County's unemployment rate. As everybody knows at this point, unemployment spiked during the pandemic. But it's also actually come down very quickly, and that has been really encouraging to see. And so on this graph, I'm showing Oakland County's unemployment rate alongside the state of Michigan's unemployment rate. And one of the first things you can see on the graph is that the unemployment rate during the pandemic actually went way above where it was during the Great Recession here in Michigan. But it also fell back down much more quickly. And Oakland County's unemployment rate in particular is now really at rock bottom levels. And so, that's great to see. We always like to see a low unemployment rate. But one reason that the unemployment rate in Oakland County is low is that we haven't seen a lot of growth in the labor force. So to be counted as officially unemployed, you have to be in the labor force. So if you're not working, you have to be looking for a job. And what we're seeing is that Oakland County's labor force just isn't growing the way we would like to see. And there could be a lot of different reasons for that. That has been a nationwide trend, that the labor force has not recovered from the pandemic the way people had hoped. On the one hand, it's good news in the sense that as you can see, Oakland County has a very low unemployment rate right now. But on the other hand, it is going to pose a challenge going forward because the county is really facing labor shortages now. And we expect those labor shortages to be a fact of life for the foreseeable future here in Oakland County. Well, before I show you our outlook for Oakland County's economy, what I want to do is situate it in our general outlook for the U.S. economy. And so this graph shows you our forecast for United States real GDP through 2025. And not to hold people in suspense, we are forecasting a mild national recession to start taking hold at the end of 2023, so later this year, or early in 2024. And what I encourage people to do is not to focus too much on whether we have an official recession, because there is actually some subjective judgment that goes into whether there's an official declaration of a recession. I always tell people it's like the college football playoff. There's a committee of people who sit down and look at the numbers, and they do look really closely at the numbers, but at the end of the day, it's a group of people who make a judgment. And so I encourage people, don't focus too much on whether we have an official recession. But what we do expect is that we're going to see some economic slowdown and softness as we get later into this year and into 2024. And the reason is that inflation has really stayed above where the Federal Reserve would like to see. And so the Fed has been raising interest rates to try to cool off the economy. And we're starting to see the effects of that tight monetary policy in terms of things like the recent banking turmoil that's been all over the news, in terms of very high mortgage rates that are slowing down activity in the mortgage finance industry and should eventually spill over into construction activity, that the residential housing market, and potentially even into the light vehicle market. So we do expect some economic softness in the second half of this year and then into early 2024. But then hopefully you can see on the graph that we expect growth to start picking back up as we get further into 2024. Inflation falls closer to the Federal Reserve's target, and the Fed starts taking its foot off the brakes of monetary policy and allowing the economy to start revving back up. So that's the basic forecast. If you look at the graph, you can see it's not much of a decline. It's very modest. By historical standards, this would be an extremely mild recession. But that is our baseline forecast. I also want to say, I do think there's a very good chance we'll have a so-called soft landing, which would mean the Fed gets inflation under control without the economy going into recession. But either way, we do expect a little bit slower growth in the second half of this year to be followed by growth picking back up as we move into the back half of 2024 and into 2025. Obviously, the outlook for the light vehicle market is an extremely important piece of the puzzle for Oakland County's economic forecast. And so this graph shows you our forecast both for national light vehicle sales in the yellow line and for Detroit 3 light vehicle sales in the blue line. And we're expecting a choppy recovery, but nonetheless a recovery in terms of vehicle sales. The supply chain difficulties and the microchip shortage in particular that have plagued the industry have improved a lot since the worst part of the crisis. We're not completely out of the woods, but we are seeing improvement. And because of that, we do expect vehicle sales to continue to recover. But what you can see on the graph is we don't expect them to get back up to where they were before the pandemic. There are a few different reasons for that. One is, as I mentioned, we do expect a very mild national recession, and we do see higher interest rates now that are really putting a dent in affordability for vehicle buyers. Another important reason we don't expect unit sales to get back up to where they were before the pandemic is we expect the Detroit 3 to prioritize pricing discipline over market share and over unit sales in a way that maybe they haven't done in the past. And if you've gone shopping for a vehicle recently, you know that prices are sky high, for lack of a better word. And certainly people do experience some sticker shock these days when they go shopping for a vehicle. We expect that trend to continue, and that's part of why we don't expect vehicle sales to get back up to where they were before the pandemic. One thing to note is that we have not assumed that there will be a strike by the UAW against the big three automakers in this forecast. Obviously, if there were a long work stoppage that disrupted production for a considerable amount of time, that would certainly affect this forecast for vehicle sales. This graph shows our forecast for total employment in Oakland County and the state of Michigan through 2025. We draw this data from a database called the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. And this is data for jobs located within Oakland County, whether the person who works at that job lives in Oakland County or commutes into the county from somewhere else. And the first thing to point out is that Oakland County has actually lagged a little bit behind the state of Michigan in terms of an employment recovery. We estimate that by the end of 2022, Oakland County had recovered about 85% of the jobs that it lost at the start of the pandemic, whereas the state of Michigan had recovered about 93% of the jobs that it lost at the start of the pandemic. The good news is that we expect that trend to reverse course over the next few years, and we expect employment in Oakland County to grow more quickly than in the state of Michigan. We're forecasting Oakland County to make a full employment recovery from the pandemic in the first half of 2025, and then to keep growing from there so that it ends our forecast period substantially above where it was before the pandemic in terms of total employment. Even though Oakland County has been lagging behind the state of Michigan in terms of its recovery from the pandemic so far, the good news is we expect that trend to reverse over the next few years, and we actually expect Oakland to grow more quickly in terms of employment than the state of Michigan. We expect Oakland County to get back up to its pre-pandemic employment level by the first half of 2025, and then to keep growing from there to end our forecast about 1.2% higher in terms of overall employment than it was before the pandemic. So, that's the good news, and it's a relatively optimistic outlook for the county economy, but I do want to throw in one caution, which is that Oakland County is going to need to see growth in its labor force to achieve that type of job growth. And labor shortages are a fact of life these days. When you talk to small business people, it invariably comes up as a problem that they face. It's not just an Oakland County problem, obviously. It's a state of Michigan problem, and it's a nationwide problem. But one challenge that we face here in Michigan in particular is that we do have an older population. And so we have more people who are getting towards what you might think of as a traditional retirement age. So if we can't find ways to creatively grow the labor force, the job growth that we're forecasting is going to be hard to come by. I did want to take a minute to dive into the industry detail behind our forecast for employment to try to explain why, even though we're forecasting a mild national recession, we expect job growth to continue here in Oakland County. And those of you who have been following the county's economy for a long time know that that's not the usual pattern. Usually when we have a national recession, Michigan and Oakland County are hit pretty hard. And the reason we do expect this time to be a little bit different than the usual historical pattern is because of the strength we're projecting in Oakland County's blue-collar industries. So these industries include the manufacturing sector and the construction sector. And obviously, the microchip shortage and the other supply chain shortages in the auto industry were so frustrating during the pandemic. It seemed like we couldn't catch a break. But they actually have a little bit of an economic silver lining today because we're forecasting a mild national recession, but we expect that a large backlog of demand in the vehicle sector ought to cushion employment as the auto manufacturers try to make up for all of those cars that they couldn't produce during the pandemic and during the microchip shortage. Likewise, we do expect that a backlog in residential construction demand should also cushion employment, at least in the short term, despite the large increase in mortgage rates. Where we really expect the large increase in interest rates and mortgage rates in particular to take a bite out of employment is in Oakland County's mortgage finance industry. It's been great to see the growth of the mortgage industry here in Oakland County recently, but obviously interest rates are well above where they were in 2022, and that is casting a shadow over the mortgage industry and over the residential housing market. So we have started to see layoffs in the mortgage industry. We aren't projecting a major downturn in the mortgage industry, but certainly that is an industry in the county's economy where we expect to see some softness certainly over the next year or two. Looking at the state's lower educational attainment service industries, these are industries that typically don't require a college degree, to work in. And they were really hit the very hardest during the pandemic. And you can see we expect a slow and steady recovery in these industries from here so that they get back to just around where they were before the pandemic in terms of total employment by the end of 2025. This slide shows you our forecast for local inflation, which is measured by the Detroit Consumer Price Index. And frankly, this is the slide I never want to talk about because it's the most painful for everyone right now. If you've been to the store recently, you know what I'm talking about, which is that inflation has really run much higher than the Federal Reserve would like to see. The relatively good news is that we do expect inflation to start falling off pretty sharply this year. And you can see that inflation gets down into the mid 2% range in our forecast by 2025. That's still a little bit higher than where the Fed would like inflation to be, but all in all, that would be a lot closer to the target than we were last year when inflation was really setting 40-year highs. Finally, I did want to just take a couple of minutes to talk about wages here in Oakland County. One of the things you can see is that average wages in the county actually spiked in 2020 during the pandemic. That's not because people were getting big raises in 2020. It's because lower income workers were more likely to lose their jobs during the pandemic. And that actually pushed the average wage up just because you had lower wage people losing their jobs disproportionately. As we moved further into the pandemic and that trend started to reverse, and especially as inflation started to pick up, you can see that average wages actually fell when you adjust for inflation. So what we call real wages adjust for inflation. And those actually fell a decent amount in 2022 just because people's wage increases didn't keep up with how fast prices were rising. And really that's why people are sour about the economy. If you ask people, well, how do you think the economy is doing? They're going to, by and large, they say, I think it's doing pretty badly. And that's even though the unemployment rate is very low, even though job growth is strong, it's because incomes aren't keeping up with prices. The good news is we do expect incomes to start growing a little bit more quickly than prices over the next few years. That means real wages will grow. But the bad news is it's going to be at a pretty modest pace. And you can see that real incomes won't get back up to where they were in the early part of the pandemic during our forecast period. One piece of good news that I do want to note here, though, is that we expect faster wage growth in some of the lower wage industries that we forecast. So in particular, what we call the lower education service industries are expected to see relatively strong wage growth over our forecast. And that should help take a bite out of economic inequality within Oakland County during this forecast period.
Thank you, Dr. Ehrlich. You just took us on an exciting journey through Oakland County's economic outlook. Let's recap some of the highlights. Dr. Ehrlich touched on a bunch of fascinating topics, like the need for Oakland County to grow its labor force, the rise in inflation, and the forecast of an 85% job recovery by 2025. He also discussed the impact of the microchip shortage on vehicle sales. In addition to that, we explored a variety of intriguing data points, such as average three-person equivalent household income, Oakland County PUMA regions, and population distributions by income group. We even compared Oakland County with its peers. He shared insights on the current state of Oakland County's economy, and we also looked at the bigger picture with the U.S. economic outlook, which included a mention of a mild recession and a deep dive into real U.S. gross domestic product. We revisited last year's forecast and checked out Oakland County's economic outlook, covering a mix of stats like monthly household employment, unemployment rates, quarterly payroll employment indices, and job indices in Oakland County by industry group. Dr. Ehrlich also talked about the annual inflation rate with Detroit CPI, average annual real wages in Michigan and Oakland County, and industry groups in Oakland County. To top it all off, we dove into industry details and payroll jobs, discussing blue-collar industries and higher and lower education attainment services industries. And there you have it. We've covered some key takeaways from Dr. Ehrlich's talk on the economic outlook in Oakland County. Remember, stay curious and keep exploring.
Because here in Oakland County, we're always moving forward.